Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture on the future of opportunity by Byron Auguste. You can tell the title is very optimistic. It's a future of opportunity rather than the opposite. Anyway, I know you came to listen to the speaker, so I'll make my usual 3 quick points before I welcome Byron to the stage. I want to begin by saying that, this topic could not possibly be more timely. All of us are thinking about the future of jobs. As you know, we've been in love with technology for over 200 years now. And we've always assumed that as you get better, more and better technology, we will all be better off, right? That's the general assumption that we have had. Now we slowly, I think, beginning to realize that it's possible that with better technology, you might actually end up with a situation where we will have less jobs. And you see examples of this. In fact, last night, I happened to be at SMU listening to the Prime Minister speak, and he gave this very powerful example. He said, see this picture of this massive crane. It was run by one operator in one cabin on top of one crane. Now you have 5 cranes, no operators, no cabins, one guy with a computer sitting on a desk operating 5 cranes. So 5 operators lost their jobs. And soon there will be 50 operators losing their jobs. And if you have driverless cars, which I think is the next big thing that's arriving, you may have 60,000 unemployed taxi drivers in Singapore. I mean, that's an example of the challenges we face for the future. So my second point actually is that as with every new challenge, you realize that you have to deal with it. And when you look at challenges like this, you actually begin to realize that the role of governments may actually become more and more important in handling this new wave of challenges that are coming our way. So I know it's fashionable to assume that markets can solve everything, markets can do a lot. I'm sure Byron will be talking about the power of markets too, but at the same time we realize that you need, in a sense, 2 hands. You need the invisible hand of free markets and the visible hand of good governance. And the reason why I emphasize that point is that to promote good governance, you actually have to support schools of public policy. So if you want to support the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, all checks are welcome. And that's my commercial. So now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, who I must say I admire his stamina. He just arrived this morning from the United States. And please, I'm sure, of course, you'll keep him awake by asking him very challenging questions after he finishes his remarks here. Byron is now the Managing Director of Opportunity at Work, a civic enterprise based at New America in Washington, D.C., which aims to rewire the U.S. labor market in ways that enable more Americans to achieve upward mobility in the job market and workplace. And I'm sure you'll be talking about that. Prior to co-founding Opportunity at Work, Byron served for 2 years in the White House as a Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and also Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. And before 2013, he was working with McKinsey for over 20 years, where he was elected principal in 1999 and director in 2005. And actually, it's in that capacity where I first met Byron, because he would be invited by Tom Friedman to speak at New York Times conferences. He'll be invited to speak in Davos, and he became the go-to speaker around the world on the future of jobs. He's the author of a book, The Economics of International Payments Unions and Clearinghouses. He received his BA from Yale, and I'm glad his son here, who's also now in Yale, is with us too. Where he was awarded the Truman Scholarship and the James Gordon Bennett Prize, and he got his MPhil and DPhil in economics from Oxford University as a Marshall Scholar. So we are truly privileged and blessed at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy to welcome a globally renowned speaker like Byron to address us. He says he'll speak for about 40 minutes or so, and I'm very confident that he will welcome very challenging questions from all of you. So, Byron, over to you.
I'm really delighted to be here. I think Singapore is very much a country that embraces the future and grapples with the future. Sometimes we in the United States maybe are a little envious of the rationality with which some of these debates happen in Singapore relative to our larger, more sprawling, messier sort of processes. But, you know, there are many roads to Rome. The title of this lecture is The Future of Opportunity, Innovation, Talent, and Work in the Next 50 Years. Now, Kishore said that I was clearly an optimist, but I commend all of you for your optimism in showing up today in hopes that I or anyone else might have a crystal ball to show that what we can all expect in the next 50 years. Despite all of our sophisticated quantitative models, economists are notoriously bad at predicting even the next business cycle, far less 50 years in the future. And of course, the most dramatic changes in human history, revolutions in technology or in politics or in social norms, tend to take many or most of our leaders in all walks of life by surprise. For example, who would have predicted in 1965 that a tiny and poor island nation with virtually no natural resources, few natural allies in a dangerous world, and a per capita income on par with other newly independent countries in sub-Saharan Africa would boast one of the highest per capita incomes in the world just 50 years later? On the other hand, who would have expected that we'd still be sitting for hours in traffic jams in 2015? We were supposed to have flying cars. So, we humans don't predict the future well. And that's partly because there are always elements of our present times that we can't imagine will change. So basic are these elements to our assumptions about how our society or our economy or how an individual must function. But we also don't predict well because the future is not just the extrapolation of technological and demographic and political trends. As Kishore just mentioned, the future will be shaped profoundly by the choices that we make, the choices that we have yet to make as individuals and families, as managers and as entrepreneurs, as writers and artists and inventors, as citizens and policymakers, and as communities, countries, and the wider community of nations. So, in recognition of this limitation, half of my lecture will cover what I believe are the major trends and forces that will shape the world's advanced economies in the years ahead, and the key implications of those trends for economic opportunity available to their citizens. And the other half of my lecture will cover the critical choices we all will have to make, my views on some of the solutions that we might be overlooking today, and some vital questions that all advanced countries, including Singapore, must answer. So, what is opportunity? The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as a time, condition, or set of circumstances permitting or favorable to a particular action or purpose. For our purposes, we'll speak of economic opportunity, which are conditions and circumstances that permit or favor the achievement for the widest possible range of people around the world to increase their earning abilities and their choices for employment, enjoyment, and investments in their future. To understand the future of economic opportunity, we must first understand how it has been generated and what pressures it faces. The first requirement for opportunity is productivity growth. Productivity is the rising ability of our economies to deliver more value for each unit of input, especially more value for every hour of labor. Without productivity growth, per capita incomes cannot grow, no matter how the pie is sliced. In a less developed economy, or one that had been closed, when it's been closed off to global trade, additions of capital and know-how and access to new markets can raise productivity in a catch-up mode. And we can see that in recent years, emerging markets and emerging economies have increased their productivity faster than have advanced economies. Now, a difference of 0.9% growth per year might not seem like much, but it's the difference between doubling a country's per capita income in 25 years versus 37 years. It's a lot better to live in an advanced economy, but it's a lot harder to grow rapidly once you are one. Once pouring in more capital and providing basic education stops driving robust productivity growth, then what's left? In one word, it's innovation. Value-creating innovation across our whole economy, private sector and public sector, is the main source of productivity growth in advanced economies. That's innovation in processes, products, and practices. I once did a lot of work with clients in the semiconductor and high-tech industries. Moore's law, that the processing power on a chip doubles every 18 months, happens not by some natural process, but through relentless invention and research into new manufacturing processes by semiconductor companies such as Intel or Micron or others to find new ways of packing more and more microscopic circuits onto every chip. That's process innovation. Using these smaller, more powerful chips, the high-tech industry has created everything from mobile phones to satellite receivers to GPS systems to smart brakes in our cars to industrial automation in our factories to advanced medical devices to online search engines and social networks. That's product innovation. But this progress would have slowed down were it not for the emergence of highly specialized companies that take on one slice of this very risky, expensive endeavor, such as semiconductor foundries, which don't design their own chips, but rent out the advanced process technology to produce the designs of others, allowing dozens of fabulous chip design startups to innovate on a level playing field with giant companies. That's innovation in practices and business models. One category of innovation that has gotten a disproportionate share of attention lately, and not always in a positive way, is the way that fast-evolving digital technology is changing business economies and our way of working. Of late, there's been a lot of breathless commentary that can be summed up as, the robots are coming, and they're coming to take your job. These are but 3 recent headlines, and one of many depictions of robots. You're going to be seeing a lot more of them. But there's something to it, because the pace of digital change is accelerating. My former colleagues at McKinsey Global Institute point out that while the radio took 38 years to reach 50 million users, Facebook and Twitter did so in just 1 year. In the decades ahead, they foresee the mobile internet, the automation of knowledge work, and the Internet of Things unleashing unprecedented torrents of big data across supply chains, customer relationships, and government services. As one example, Uber, a software platform matching taxi drivers to passengers, has grown to thousands of drivers in city after city, first in the US and now around the world, in a matter of months, heralding the growth of what some are calling the gig economy. But that's just the beginning, because while Uber is disrupting the taxi industry, even that model could be disrupted shortly by the advent of self-driving vehicles, with Google, Uber, and other companies competing to provide riders with safe, convenient, self-driving fleets, with millions of current jobs disrupted and new jobs born. It's interesting, this is data from the United States, and you'll see that there are almost 4 million professional drivers in the United States, so all of those jobs are in principle at risk from self-driving cars. On the other side of the ledger, there are 4 million others that are involved in repair and maintenance and sales and the like. And the question there is whether those jobs will be disrupted, or in fact, whether those jobs will be enhanced. And in fact, will there be opportunities for all sorts of personalization and all sorts of value-added services? We don't know the answer to the question, but that in microcosm is the critical question about whether technology just destroys jobs. Because, of course, it destroys jobs, and that we always know the jobs that it destroys because they exist already. But it also creates jobs, and we don't know those jobs yet, which is one thing that makes it so scary. But if automation is the issue, this change is not as new as it seems. Automation and the increased labor productivity that results from it have been changing the structure of the workforce since the Industrial Revolution began. This chart shows the rise and fall of employment in agriculture, manufacturing, and services over 200 years in the United States, as the mechanization of farming and the automation of factories reduced the need for workers. Our occupational statistics are inadequate to tell the story of what's happening now, as within the services sector, as the rise of new jobs depending on creativity, knowledge, and the personal touch, and designing, overseeing, and repairing the machines we depend on are emerging in this next wave. However, There are no guarantees that the future will resemble the past in this respect. In their book, Race Against the Machine, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee talk about an age of brilliant machines and the second half of the chessboard in artificial intelligence and automation. The chessboard refers to the power of exponential improvements and the parable of a king who agreed to grant a wise man who impressed him with grains of rice, starting with a single grain that doubled on each square of the chessboard. By the second half of the chessboard, the king had emptied his kingdom's granary, and the wise man had won all of his wealth. That's the power of exponential change, and the question is whether this exponential growth in computing power and networks, and particularly in software platforms and artificial intelligence and big data and predictive analytics embedded in them, will render almost all tasks performed by humans today to be doable by machines. Will it replace that work? Paradoxically, I believe that in technological terms, the vast majority of the tasks performed at work by humans today will be doable by machines in 50 years, or perhaps in 100. But I also believe, quite fervently, that we can keep machines as the helpmates of people rather than our masters if we change the way we conceive of work and if we change the incentives to deploy technology. Because let's face it, computers are better at executing repetitive tasks or algorithms, however complex, than people are. So if we continue to design our work as repetitive algorithmic tasks, then we will lose the race to the machine. If you want people to beat machines at work, you have to design work that taps what's essential in people, not what's optimal to machines. And we'll talk more about that. So finally, to survey the future of opportunity, we must acknowledge that our lives are not infinite, nor are resources inexhaustible. Aging populations around the world will slow per capita income growth and workforce participation, putting more pressure on both today's and tomorrow's younger workers and government budgets. Maybe we do need all those robot workers after all. Moreover, demand for energy, metals, food, and water has grown fiercely since 2000 and will continue to do so in the decades ahead. We cannot meet a growing world's natural resource demands by increases in supply alone. We need to unleash all of our innovation to compete against the problem, to massively increase the productivity of natural resources and its use in all of our economies. Now that Singapore has fully joined the advanced economies club, filled with old rich countries rather than poor young ones, it may be that some of the US experience in navigating these challenges will be relevant. I spent most of the past 2 years in the White House working as Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, which coordinates economic policies across the US federal government and advises President Obama on economic decisions. In that capacity, I worked closely with economists at the Council of Economic Advisors, who produce each year an economic report to the President. The 2015 report was released this February and focused on the challenges of ensuring economic opportunity for all Americans in light of these global trends. It frames 3 elements of opportunity: productivity, participation, and distribution, which it tracks across recent decades in the United States. In terms of productivity, the US has recovered relatively well compared to Europe's advanced economies in the years since the financial crisis, with 1.8% annual growth in GDP per working age adult. Interestingly, Japan has performed even better on that dimension, a fact that is masked by Japan's rapid demographic decline. But for the median American family, that decent productivity story has not translated into substantial real income gains. In fact, Americans' median family income has declined by 4% since 2008 and remains 7% lower than it was some 15 years ago. So what explains this opportunity paradox in which productivity growth is fairly strong, but median family incomes are stagnant or falling. We need to dig a bit deeper to understand it. This chart divides the 7 decades of the post-war era into 3 periods of middle-class income growth and opportunity in the United States. In the first column, from 1948 to 1973, the age of shared growth, the U.S. saw robust growth in median household incomes. In fact, 2.8% per year compounded. That's as fast as the emerging market productivity growth we saw in an earlier chart. It saw a modest increase in workforce participation and a highly equitable distribution of the benefits of growth. The not yet famous top 1% saw its share of national income decline, while the bottom 90% grew faster than the top 10%. In this era, U.S. productivity growth truly lifted the fortunes of most working Americans. These dynamics changed dramatically in the following 2 decades. That's the middle column, roughly 1973 to 1985. U.S. productivity growth fell in half to 1.4% annually, offset in household incomes by a surge of new workforce participation by American women. While income grew slowly, the share of income going to the top 1% almost doubled to 13.5%, and that share going to the bottom 90% fell by 9 points. That's something over $1 trillion US in today's economy that was shifted away from the bottom 90%. This is a picture of American families working more hours as if running up a down escalator. Finally, last column, in the 2 decades from 1995 until last year, the U.S. saw productivity growth rebound to 2.3% annually, but our workforce participation stalled, then fell to 63% of the population over 16. Upward distribution of U.S. income continued as the bottom 90% shed over 6 percentage points of national income to the top 10%, 2/3 of which went only to the top 1%. So how have these changes manifested themselves in the U.S. labor market? By a deep bifurcation, with jobs at both the creative and managerial high-skilled end of the job market and the lower-skilled, lower-paying jobs in non-tradable personal services, home and elder care, sanitation and security services growing rapidly, whereas the jobs in the middle-skilled and middle-income jobs have been growing far more slowly. So, what can we conclude from this story? At a macro level, we see the history and the future of economic opportunity in advanced economies as a story of productivity, workforce participation, and distribution of the fruits of economic growth. 2 more things that I want to underscore. First, while we can and should seek to increase labor force participation, and while the U.S. has done so poorly over the past 20 years, demographics will almost certainly drive down workforce participation worldwide. As you see in this slide, more than half of the falling participation in the U.S. is the result of an aging workforce. Second, to emphasize, virtually all of the swings in U.S. productivity, all of the ups and downs, came from changes in what economists call total factor productivity, which just means the innovation in processes and products and practices that we discussed earlier. By contrast, you'll see those bottom two parts of the bar, that the impact of capital investment and of education quality was almost totally constant throughout. It's really just the ups and downs of this innovation and this total factor productivity that have driven the change. So that's the view from the US, which has some differences, but certainly many similarities to other advanced economies such as Singapore. So now I want to talk about the paths we might go down and the decisions all countries face to secure the future of opportunity. So what does the future hold? Which path will we take? And here I offer you all apologies in advance for massively oversimplifying a set of choices that are not very simple at all. But here we go nonetheless. Path 1, the Luddite reaction. Many people around the world are deeply uncomfortable with a path of technology that automates the only jobs they know how to do, whether or not they are offered retraining or state benefits to find another way of life. As we consider our choices, it's always worth remembering that work is not just the source of income and purchasing power. It is for many, if not most, also a source of meaning and identity, a source of pride and independence, and even a way of life. So, as you can see, our societies won't necessarily accept the march of technology and automation. The photos in this slide are from just last week in France, from protests by French taxi drivers against the Uber car service. Uber may well be a more efficient technology with the potential to expand the taxi market enormously, but current taxi drivers are not at all impressed by these arguments, and the French government has banned Uber. Now, the question to ask is, if this is a scene of protest against software that matches passengers to human drivers, then what will the protest look like against replacing human drivers with self-driving cars? In my view, it would be a mistake to believe that technology will triumph and automatically and ultimately bend the rest of society to its inexorable trend lines. Since Imperial China, at the time the most technologically advanced economy on Earth, abandoned long-distance seafaring in the mid-1400s, we've seen political and societal concerns stop technology adoption in its tracks many times and in many societies. Path 2. Let's call this the Metropolis Gattaca scenario. There's a classic old German movie, Metropolis, released in 1927, that is set in a future dystopian city where wealthy industrialists rule over an exploited underclass of laborers who actually dwell underground. This fear of a vast gulf between rich and poor is echoed in many movies of our times, such as the movie Gattaca in 1997 or Elysium in 2013. Science fiction fears always echo the realities and trends of the time in which they're made. In 1927, the gap between the richest 1% and the average citizen in Western countries was the greatest it had ever been. In the US, this disparity peaked in 1929, never reaching those levels again until 2010, 5 years ago. We've reached a moment where the fear that civic cohesion and any sense of civic equality can be maintained in the face of self-reinforcing disparities in economic outcomes and opportunity has reached a fever pitch. And if you want to know more about why the world could face this scenario of ultimate division of humanity into the wealthy, educated, and engaged versus the poor, low-skilled, and economically discarded, you don't need to read science fiction. You can read Thomas Piketty or Joseph Stiglitz or pioneers in robotics who can tell you just how this could happen. So I won't spend a lot of time on this. I want to talk to you instead about how we get to an alternative future of opportunity, a future in which we manage to unlock a new surge of broad-based productivity growth based on talent, human talent, intelligence, and motivation that are largely untapped today. But wait, hold on. Those of you who've been listening closely must be about to jump out of your seats to protest this scenario, right? I mean, after all the data I just showed you about the trends in automation of work, the aging world population, and declining productivity growth in advanced economies, how do I even have the nerve to put up such a rosy scenario for the next 50 years up on the screen? So if you'll give me just a few more minutes before you rush the stage and demand that I go on my way, here's my answer. Path 3 is possible by tapping into the natural resource that we have least exploited on our planet, human talent and human potential. We may not go down this path, but I firmly believe that it exists. The potential to accelerate economic growth on a far more equitable and balanced path of opportunity is hiding from us in plain sight. So, why do I believe that tapping human talent can be our solution? First, because we are underutilizing human talent today, massively. Second, because emerging technology and relatively inexpensive changes in behavior, policies, practices, and mindsets can realize that potential. And third, because such a solution to our productivity challenge will will make it far easier to solve our participation and distribution puzzle. Now, I don't need to argue that making the most of our talents would be a good thing. I'm sure that you all believe that in principle. Moreover, I can't prove to you that this strategy can have the macroeconomic scale of impact that I believe it can, in part because as societies, we measure what we value, and we don't bother to measure human potential very well at all. But I want to share with you a little bit of evidence and the empirical logic that has persuaded me. First, humans have far more learning potential than we believe. Children have amazing, unacknowledged potential to teach themselves. In an experiment made famous in a TED Talk, Professor Sugata Mitra of Newcastle University embedded a computer in a wall of a slum in New Delhi and found that children, without any supervision, could teach themselves how to use it. Repeating this throughout India, he saw children record their own music and even teach themselves to speak with a neutral British accent so that a speech-to-text program could understand them. That untapped potential can be amplified by education. The best human personal tutors can consistently increase their students' performance by 2 standard deviations, for example, from the 50th percentile to the 98th percentile. Applying artificial intelligence and big data to the challenge of replicating such dramatic learning gains, Stanford University researchers, funded by DARPA, have compressed IT systems management training into 18 weeks with stellar results. In addition to the technology of learning, inculcating students with a growth mindset boosts their performance further. The insight of Stanford professor Carol Dweck that teaching children that academic success is the product of hard work and that ability is not fixed but can be stretched by their efforts leads to improvements in their academic performance that has been validated by multiple randomized experiments. Similarly, a program called Jump Math, pioneered in Canada, starts from the premise that all children are gifted in mathematics and structures lessons explicitly to facilitate mastery of seemingly complex math problems in ways that boost students' self-belief as mathematicians. And it has achieved double the results of other mathematics curriculums and has begun to spread worldwide. So human potential is immense, and I could give you dozens more examples. But the second thing is that there is really strong evidence that we are not tapping into that potential today. This is a map from the International PISA math exam for 15-year-olds. Most advanced countries today have very high correlation between socioeconomic status and performance. What you're seeing on this slide, on the vertical axis, so the higher up you go, the better your performance, the better the performance of your 15-year-olds in math. And the further you go to the right, the less correlation there is between an individual child's performance and their socioeconomic status. So in the upper left, for example, it's very high performance, but very much based on the well-off perform well and the poor perform poorly. If you were up in the very top right-hand corner, that would be where you were at the top performance, but you were also at the top equity. You need to be all the way over to the right before you've eliminated the impact of socioeconomics. So no country has made that irrelevant, made poverty irrelevant. Singapore, even with its high performance on the PISA, is only in the middle of the pack for equity. The US does even worse, about average in both performance and equity. But think again about those children in the slum in India and their ability to learn, and then think about these results. And these are for advanced economies, to say nothing of the other countries in the world. We're not tapping into that potential. And then if anything, our institutions do even worse at tapping the potential of adults. The opinion research firm Gallup has measured employee engagement around the world using a 12-question survey since the late 1990s, where respondents agree or disagree with statements such as, "At work, my opinions seem to count," and "This last year, I had opportunities at work to learn and grow." Gallup finds that just 13% of workers are actively engaged on the job, which means that they can work with passion. In fact, 24% of the global workforce is actively disengaged. That's twice as many as that are engaged. These are people that are not just unhappy at work, They are actively undermining their companies because they feel so bitter about their working conditions. Twice as many as those that are actively engaged, So using this massive data set, by the way, I noticed that Singapore is not too hot, not too cold. Only 9% of Singaporeans are engaged at work. I'm sure all of you are in that 9%. But there are not too many Singaporeans actually sabotaging their companies. It's only about 15%, so that's not too bad. So using this massive data set, Gallup found that the median difference between a top quartile and bottom quartile levels of engagement in business units caused a 21% boost in productivity, 25% less turnover, 37% less absenteeism, and 41% fewer defects in the products. Now think about the huge economic benefit if we could triple the share of workers that are engaged. That still wouldn't be a majority. Harder to measure, but most fundamentally of all, our entire economic system, our corporations, our stock markets, our management consultants, etc., all exist to optimize the return on invested capital. That's the capital that a company can own, capital like machines and software. Very few of our institutions are designed to optimize a return on human capital. Human capital belongs to everyone. It can walk out the door of a company. And so the incentives for our system are really to take all of this tremendous capacity, this capital, this innovative energy to optimize return on invested capital. And labor is an input to that. Interestingly, we are starting to see signs, and I'll talk about this in a bit, of new forms of business organization that are actually more aligned with maximizing return on talent. And I would argue that these will be huge successful businesses of the future, or we better hope so. And keep in mind that when we talk about human capital in the balance sheet of a country, it's at least as big as invested capital. And if measured correctly, would probably be 2 or 3 times as large. But we've been doing very little to optimize it. Again, that's huge potential. So, what kind of innovations could matter? Kishore mentioned that I co-founded a nonprofit, a social venture called Opportunity at Work in the United States. This was 3 months ago after leaving the White House. The purpose is to develop an operating system for the US labor market. The starting point is thinking about what we call in America the skills gap. You have, I'm sure, a version of it here, a skills mismatch, where the skills that businesses want to hire and the skills available in the workforce or the credentials seem to be different and mismatched. Our view is that this is not a cause of our labor market dysfunction. It is the effect of a dysfunctional labor market, along with a declining labor mobility and a declining job mobility and stagnant wages. But we think there are solutions. One solution, and an essential one, lies in employer practices. We believe that employers need to hire based on competence, readiness, and attitude, not just on resume experience or academic pedigree. And I have a short video here that I don't know how to play, so I'm hoping someone does, about Leshawna Lewis, who is the beneficiary of part of this system.
Well, let me wrap up with just the example of one person, a woman named Leshawna Lewis. Where's Leshawna? She's here today.
For many, many years I've been coding, and one of that I ended up doing was getting kind of shoved into customer service for like 10 years. But let's roll back the clock.
Now, the reason Leshawna's story is so relevant is Leshawna grew up in East St. Louis.
I spent 18 years of my life there. I went to high school and I approached the computer science teacher and I said, I want to go in and I want to learn how to program. And he said, okay, take a seat. He encouraged me, my mother and my family encouraged me, and I just decided to go into college as a computer science major. And I ended up having to leave. And it was kind of a very depressing part for me.
And because she didn't have a college degree, she couldn't even get an interview for a tech job. despite her coding skills. So she was working as a bus driver, and she was working in entry-level jobs.
I never really fully got a chance to go into technology like I wanted to. So that's when I ended up going to Launch Code, and the rest of it is history.
Leshawna had the skills. Launch Code went to bat for her. And today she's a system engineer at MasterCard.
It changed my life. I have an opportunity that I wouldn't think for years that I'd be able to get.
So we got to create more stories like Leshawna's. And if we do, then we are going to more effectively capture what is the boundless energy and talent of Americans who, have the will, but sometimes need a little help clearing out the way.
I would describe Launch Code as an opportunity to show yourself. I feel like Launch Code actually took a look at me and my skills and saw what I can do and took me to the next level.
So Leshawna's story is an inspiring story, and she's an inspiring person. But Leshawna is not alone. Leshawna Lewis had to drop out of university for financial reasons, and she worked as a bus driver. She worked in call centers, but throughout she kept up her passion for coding, for computer programming. And in fact, over 40% of current computer programmers don't have a 4-year bachelor's degree, and 20% are almost entirely self-taught. And yet, someone like Leshawna that doesn't have the track record or the academic credentials can't, for the most part, get a job or even a job interview there. So why does this matter? It matters because employer practices, if when employers go out to recruit for a job, if what they are looking for is a resume history, then that's really just a search algorithm. It's not really a demand signal, because it's a request for something that someone had to spend the last 10 or 15 years of their lives doing. It's not a request for something they can learn. Whereas if you change what you're looking for to skills mastery, to say we want demonstrations of ability to do X, Y, and Z, then that's a demand signal for something that someone can learn. And it sets an incentive for people to also be trained and to train people for those jobs. Today, there are 5.5 million open jobs in the United States. Over 600,000 of them are in information technology, 2/3 of those jobs outside of the tech industry. And yet, there are tens of thousands of people like Leshawna who could do those jobs today, but can't get those jobs. And there are millions more Americans with the aptitude to learn those skills, but there's no business model to teach them those skills because they couldn't get the job even if they had the skills. So breaking making a more functional demand signal that really helps drive a market for skills mastery is the first step. Once you do that, then there are all sorts of ways that you can open up an enormous market in learning and tapping into the talent potential. So just one example here. This is an example from one of the coding boot camps, accelerating training providers, teaching people how to code in typically in about 12, 14, 16 weeks. This is Flatiron in New York City. It's 3 to 4 months of training. They have 98% completion rates. They have almost 100% job placement rates. And initial starting salary of $74,000 US, which for the people who take these courses is an increase of $20,000 from what they earned in their previous job. And what's interesting is that because this is expensive, it costs about $12,000 US, 90% of those who have benefited are people who already went to university but now want to learn how to code. But it turns out that the 10% who didn't go to university are do just as well in this program. That it's not that they don't have the potential, it's that they don't have the access. So what we are doing at Opportunity at Work is we have 21 cities in the United States that have brought together a critical mass of their employers. Several hundred employers signed up already, and we have data now, again from technology, to say exactly what are the jobs that are missing, and the employers agree to hire based on competencies. And with that, we've been able to bring in new training programs and create a market, not just a set of government programs to support it. And then finally, the reason that we can tap this is technology. So the same technology that is being used to automate tasks can absolutely be deployed to optimize talent, to match people to their highest and best use, and to accelerate learning. My colleagues, my former colleagues at the McKinsey Global Institute just put out a report on what they call online talent platforms. These are a set of companies that like Elance, for example, that actually have workers around the world in a marketplace for performing tasks. And it started out with very simple tasks in places like TaskRabbit, but now it's very complex tasks like interior design and so forth, and they can contract independently. And actually, these entities have an incentive to maximize the value of the talent on their platform because they get a share of the transaction that results. And then you have markets like LinkedIn, which is more of an information market that now has 300 million people around the world. So the McKinsey Global Institute estimated that $2.7 trillion of value could be created by 2025 from these markets, from increased participation, from reduction of unemployment, and from faster matching of jobs. And again, the question to ask is, why do we think that the only way we can use technology is to replace people? Why can't we be deploying technology to support people to reach their highest and best use? That's the way that we can achieve this goal. So, in conclusion, since we all have personal choices to make in how we engage in shaping the future, I want to end this lecture on a personal note. My parents also came from island nations, which gained their independence around the same time as Singapore. Some 55 years ago, my father set sail from his island home of St. Lucia in the Caribbean to move to London. All of his brothers and sisters left the island too, because there was no work at home. They scattered around the English-speaking world, although I don't think any are in Singapore, but let me know. My dad didn't see many of them for decades because telephoning was too expensive, so they wrote letters. But they left a legacy because now, about once a month, I get a Facebook friend request from someone somewhere claiming to be my cousin. There are hundreds of them, apparently. So I started this lecture reflecting on how difficult it is to peer 50 years into the future. Well, my father and his siblings never guessed that 50 years later, after they left their home, that communications would be nearly free, with 1.4 billion people linked together in one single network software application. That they could observe their old hometown of Castries St. Lucia up close on Google Earth. Or that they could stay at home to work for US or UK companies without immigrating from call centers in St. Lucia. My parents eventually left England and moved to Canada, then to the US, where they settled in Detroit, Michigan. In the 1950s, Detroit was the highest earning city in America, not because its rich residents were particularly rich, but because its middle class and its modestly educated working class had secure and well-paying jobs at the vanguard of American industrial innovation. Detroit had been the Silicon Valley of the immediate post-war era. By the time my parents arrived in 1970, Detroit had seen better days, but they could still find good work in the local electric utility and in a family-owned food factory. Besides moving to the United States, the moment that defined my family's trajectory of opportunity was in 1972, when my father saw an advertisement for a training program to learn something called COBOL, a computer language for the IBM mainframes that companies were then buying up as fast as they could, and for which there was a shortage of programmers. The ad promised that anyone who could master this computing language could get a job as a programmer, no matter what his or her background. My father did not have a university degree, but he quit his job as a factory shipping clerk and studied hard for 6 months to learn COBOL. As it turned out, he did master the COBOL language, and he did get a job as a computer programmer. In fact, a series of jobs that brought the Auguste family firmly into the American middle class. Our story of opportunity had a happy ending, but it was not an inevitable one. Many non-obvious choices made it possible. IBM decided to invest an enormous sum in basic research and development before it could know for certain if there would even be a commercial market for computers. An entrepreneur realized that companies and universities could not train COBOL programmers rapidly enough and decided to start a business that succeeded by converting students' talent and motivation into newly marketable skills. Desperate for these new skills, employers decided that they would hire anyone who could do the job well, whether or not they had a college degree or had even worked in an office before. And with my mother's moral and financial support, my father decided to take a chance, quit his job, and learn something new on the hope and promise that it would bring a better life. None of these choices, these decisions, could be taken for granted. Will our most sophisticated companies devote almost all of their profits to paying out dividends and buying back their own shares? Or will they reinvest them in creating new technologies and methods and delivering valuable new services with newly trained workers? These decisions will matter. Will our public policies and educational systems continue to act as if our workers and citizens had learned all they will need to learn by the time they're 25 years old? Or will they reflect the need and the potential for continuous learning and improvement throughout our very long lives? These decisions will matter. And will you here in this audience, who either are or will be leaders in your schools, your communities, your businesses, and your country, choose to hang on to the tried and true, or will you decide to take it upon yourself to be entrepreneurs and builders of opportunity for those around you in whatever field of endeavor you choose? Your decision will matter. And I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to entertain questions. And by the way, I would add that if you have a comment to make, you do not need to disguise it as a question. Just fire away. Thank you.